those of you new here this afternoon, I'm Stephen Hayward, Senior Resident Scholar at the Institute of Governmental Studies and lecturer at Berkeley Law. And the theme of this afternoon's two panels is what we're calling the blurred lines over free speech, hate speech, and academic freedom. And so it's not news to anybody who pays any attention at all that college campuses are nowadays at a boil that haven't really been seen, I think, since the 1960s over the issues of identity, safety and security, and the acceptable limits of provocative speech acts. And administrators here at Berkeley and elsewhere are struggling to find a stable policy that honors the traditions of academic freedom, as well as the laws that protect free speech. So this first panel of the afternoon is going to deliberate about several flashpoints, including Title IX, hate speech, or what might be called in these uncertain terms of non-inclusive speech, and what the limits of campus expression may be. So I'm going to introduce the entire panel now all at once, and then we'll all go in order. We'll each talk for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll have some discussion and invite audience participation and questions. And since it's a small affair, I hope it becomes rather deliberative, and I will try and make things go in a sequential way to the extent that I can. Now, one of the more interesting indirect sources of controversy has been Title IX, which might not seem like a free speech issue on the surface. Title IX, I know Lindsay Shepherd was saying, being from Canada, that she didn't know what Title IX is. It was the statute passed way back in the 1970s to promote greater equality of educational opportunity for women. And in recent years, it has been extended to the realm of the most intimate personal relationships between students. What could go wrong? And if that wasn't difficult enough, there was the curious case a while back of the Northwestern University professor Laura Kipnis, who found herself drawn through several Title IX proceedings, not for any acts that she had committed, but for writing about Title IX. And so in other words, speaking about Title IX became a problematic Title IX potential violation. And so our first speaker is Shep Melnick from Boston College. He's the Thomas P. or Tip O'Neill Professor of American Politics. I like to joke that, for those of you who don't know the history, Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House, was the great, legendary adversary of President Ronald Reagan, fellow Irishman. And back when I was the Ronald Reagan professor at Pepperdine, I used to joke with Shep that we ought to do a little act on the road and reenact the Reagan-O'Neill debates in Irish pubs across America. So we never got our act together on that, but it was a fun idea. Has a brand new book out right now called The Transformation of Title IX, Regulating Gender Equality in Education, from Brookings Institution Press. And this is the latest in a long line of fine books from Shep on law and politics he's published over the years. Second, they'll go in this order, not necessarily the order you see them here. I wanted very much today to include the perspective of a student or young academic who is maneuvering in the present climate. And so I'm delighted that Lindsay Shepherd of Laurier University in Canada, you have some fans, this is great. I'm delighted that Lindsay is with us. Also from Canada, to show that this controversy is not limited to American universities alone. As a graduate student teaching assistant in the field of cultural analysis and social theory, she became overnight the subject of international attention with the public release of her surreptitious recording of her upbraiding by the administration for the sin of showing 5 minutes of Jordan Peterson's, who had appeared on national television in Canada. And the content of that recording proved so shocking that the university immediately and profusely apologized for her treatment. One wonders how many apologies universities might have to issue if all such meetings were on the public record. So I've asked Lindsay Shepherd to offer her perspective as a young academic, just starting out, on how the current intellectual climate affects how she thinks about speaking and teaching in the classroom, what kind of research topics are pursued, and what academic freedom means to the next generation. Third, last night, Harvey Mansfield drew our attention to ways in which some of the current campus controversies are actually a reflection of the partisan split in the country. They don't always come to sight that way. It's not evident on the surface. Larry Alexander, who is the Warren Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of San Diego, along with his co-author Amy Wax of Penn, incited a hot controversy with an op-ed article several months ago in the Philadelphia Inquirer, which advocated on behalf of old-fashioned middle-class bourgeois virtues, concerning which, in my opinion, there's abundant evidence in conventional social science on their side. Nonetheless, the ensuing firestorm over this expression of unconventional opinion, unconventional for a college campus, though it might appear, I don't know, in the Republican Party platform, continues to make new chapters, including just in the last 10 days. Finally, what do students think? You know, I'm a great consumer of survey data, but also a critic of it, because it's difficult to pierce the cognitive dissonance that many people have towards abstract principles or questions like free speech. Too often we rest on what pollsters call the top line of surveys, and surveys don't often do a very good job of probing the nuances and complications to find out what a respondent's bottom line might be. And there are new surveys of students out, sort of general surveys across the country, just in the last couple of weeks, where students tell pollsters that they're strongly for free speech, but. Now, Milton Friedman, who I knew pretty well, always liked to say, nothing counts before the but. And so what you find from these recent surveys is a significant plurality of students say they also think there should be some limits on free speech, or that the idea of inclusiveness should somehow form the anchor of a limiting principle for campus speech. There's been some thought of trying to survey Berkeley students on this question, but the effort is stalled at the moment on account of some of the usual bureaucratic difficulties of a large public university. Fortunately, after the protests last year that prevented Heather McDonald from speaking at Claremont McKenna College, just a day after she spoke here at Berkeley without controversy, the Claremont McKenna decided to do an in-depth survey of its students to go several levels deep into these questions. And so today, joining us from Claremont McKenna is George Thomas, the Burnett Woolford Professor of American Institutions at Claremont. He helped oversee this survey, and I've seen a few portions of it I found very useful. And I've asked him to present some of those findings from the survey of Claremont students and to offer his broader thoughts on where we go from here. So with that, Shep, I'm going to let you go first, whether you can stay here or go up to the podium, whatever is your preference.
Hey, I'll just stay here. Thanks, it's a pleasure to be here. As Steve indicated, the topic of this panel is on the threats to free inquiry and free speech on a campus. I think there's a broad agreement that this is a problem, but there's a lot of disagreement about what are the causes of the problem. What I want to do is mention 4 possibilities and then show how the actions of federal administrators, especially under Title IX, have really cemented these various parts of the anti-free speech coalition. So who are the usual suspects? Well, first we have students. And it's quite possible that students have, their ideas about free speech and free inquiry have changed. Probably the most famous statement of this is Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt's article on the coddling of the American mind. There's been recent polling data to say that a minority of students are are suspicious of free speech, and I guess George will talk about that. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is faculty, the well-known leftward tilt of the university professorship, tenured radicals, and it could be that because of this change, Nietzsche and Foucault have replaced John Stuart Mill as the reigning beliefs in the university. Third possibility, the ever-growing number of academic bureaucrats who are interested in extending their power by promising to protect vulnerable students and are insinuating themselves more and more into the curriculum. And finally, federal regulators who have expanded the definition of civil rights laws to cover many forms of speech. Now, I'm going to talk primarily about the latter and how they've extended the power of the first 3 groups. Well, let me just build on what Steve said about Title IX and other civil rights laws and freedom of speech. You might wonder, why are civil rights offices setting limits on freedom of speech? And to indicate why this is, let me read a few things from the so-called Dear Colleague letters issued by the Office for Civil Rights in the Department of Education. Federal regulators no longer use formal regulations, they just issue letters to their so-called colleagues in schools. Sexual harassment, the Office for Civil Rights says, includes verbal conduct. I like that term, it's such an oxymoron. Verbal conduct. Such as making sexual comments, jokes, or gestures, spreading sexual rumors, rating students on sexual activity, or creating emails or websites of a sexual nature. To violate Title IX, such harassment need not be directed at a specific target, need not involve repeated incidents, or even be motivated by an attempt to harm. So some schools, for example, Colorado College, have suspended students for posting on social media offensive jokes not mentioning or aimed at anyone in particular. Steve mentioned Laura Kipnis at Northwestern. Another instance in which Title IX has been used to remove a faculty member from tenure came at Louisiana State University, where a tenured faculty member was accused of harassment, and her tenure was taken away from her for using salty language in her lectures. Nor must speech be related to sexual activity to violate Title IX. OCR's guidelines also prohibit gender-based harassment, which includes verbal hostility based on sex or sex stereotyping. Thus, the school violates Title IX whenever, quote, students are harassed either for exhibiting what is perceived as stereotypical characteristics for sex, or for failing to conform to sexual stereotypical notions of masculinity and femininity. Schools, OCR has said, are responsible for educating the entire school community on the expectations of tolerance, especially as they apply to sexual stereotypes. This means that schools are expected to monitor and control the behavior of ordinary discussion, often quite immature and sometimes offensive, on the playground and in school dorms. So in a variety of ways, sexual harassment has been extended to require many, many forms of ordinary speech. Now, you might wonder, how is it possible that a small federal agency that has only a little more than 500 administrators can ever do all of this? Especially since the OCR has gone well beyond what the Supreme Court said is required by Title IX or Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. So how do they do this? And I would describe the administrative strategy of the Office for Civil Rights as harass and colonize. Harass means to subject them to investigation so long and onerous and potentially dangerous to their reputation that schools capitulate and sign a very elaborate agreement with the Office for Civil Rights. And that agreement will include building up a very strong office for of the Title IX coordinator. And this office has many, many responsibilities, including not just kind of weeding out bad actors, but engage in training of all sorts. And now training really requires training of students, of adjudicators, of faculty, of staff, of police, and then conducting climate checks of what students and everyone else think about the problem of sexual discrimination on campus. So it's a very large set of responsibilities, which requires hiring a lot of people. Peter Lake of Stetson University, who studied this most thoroughly, estimates that between 2011 and 2015, colleges spent more than $100 million to comply with Title IX sexual harassment guidelines, most of it in the form of salaries to those employed in Title IX offices. As a result of this, Lake says, well, the Title IX coordinators are now starting to become almost like an academic department, teaching people about cultural change. Some of these offices have grown quite rapidly. For example, Swarthmore College, a college with only 1,500 students, has appointed 4 new Title IX deputy coordinators, as well as a Title IX coordinator, a Title IX fellow, plus a violence prevention educator and advocate in the health center, and new sexual misconduct investigators in the police department. Most of these Title IX coordinators are former OCR attorneys. That was what happened at Harvard when they hired 2 new people to head the office. They were both former OCR attorneys. The University of North Carolina now has 7 full-time Title IX coordinators and are complaining that they don't have enough business, enough complaints, and are inviting more complaints to keep them busy. Not surprisingly, these offices often develop a very strong sense of mission. For example, the coordinator of Dartmouth's Sexual Assault Awareness Program at a panel on the topic asked, why could we not expel a student based on an allegation? Only a tiny fraction of accusations are unfounded. The vast majority of assaults go unreported. Therefore, she said, it seems to me that if we value fair and equitable process more than we value the safety of our students, and higher education is not a right, safety is a right, higher education is a privilege. Therefore, expel them first and then hold a hearing after that. I'll give you one other example of the mission, a sense of mission of these organizations, and this quote comes from Laura Bennett, who is the president of the Association for Student Conduct Administrators. I must admit before this, I didn't know there was a National Association of Student Conduct Administrators, and that in itself I think is pretty scary. When she was asked, what would we need to see to know that these programs are effective? And she said there are 2 things that prove me that these programs are effective. First, there's adequate staffing for prevention and response, funding for ongoing training. Title IX coordinators, student conduct administrators, and campus law enforcement are empowered by presidents and attorneys to make relevant policy decisions. So first, empower the bureaucracy. Second, faculty discuss consent in healthy and unhealthy relationships in every course. Students confront misogyny and homophobic behaviors and statements, and the student party culture changes as a result of the healthier conceptions of masculinity and multiple positive identities for all genders and orientation. In other words, let us into your classroom and we will teach you about masculinity and sexual orientation. Not surprisingly, this effort has gained a lot of support in gender studies and identity studies programs. Now, at the same time, the regulations from the top also require these Title IX offices to build alliances with student groups to establish, as one very typical agreement said, to establish a committee of students with representatives of various student groups, including women's groups, student athletes, and others, to assist students in understanding their rights under Title IX and recommend strategies to prevent sexual discrimination and harassment. In 2016, OCR reprimanded the University of New Mexico for failing to engage students to ensure that it's meeting the needs of a diverse community, because every community, whether it be based on religion or race or ethnicity or sexual orientation or disability or gender identity, has to have a unique program aimed at them. Therefore, Title IX coordinators have to bring all of these groups in and deal with their unique needs, which of course is welcomed by people who view students above all in terms of their unique identity. Now, so my point is that these offices really bring together a variety of constituencies, each of which tends to be a minority in its own group. A small group of students, a small group of faculty, a larger group of administrators into a coalition that is very hard to face off against. Perhaps the most sweeping presentation of the aspirations of these new Title IX bureaucracies comes from the Harvard Office of Sexual Assault Prevention and Response. And I say once again here, Harvard leads the nation. And this is a quote from that office, from their website. Rape culture is ubiquitous. It manifests itself in the print, music, and film media we consume, the language we use to talk about sex and relationships, and the laws that govern our public and private spaces. Every day we are bombarded with messages that teach us to believe coercion is consent. That is how rape culture is created and perpetuated through deeply embedded social norms. What that means is, in order to undo the rape culture, you have to change the way we think about sex and sexual relations. It means also, as this website puts it, creating social spaces free from harassing language and harmful behavior. Students need, quote, to understand how attitudes and behaviors are connected, and to be taught to feel comfortable and empowered to confront harmful language, attitudes, and behavior at all times, including when someone makes a sexually suggestive comment about someone else on the street. In other words, we have to cleanse ourselves about the oppressive beliefs by looking inward and alleviating our own implicit bias. Now, I don't want to just pick on Harvard, so I thought I would pick on Princeton. Because Steve was earlier talking about interesting ads. Last year, Princeton had an ad to deal with the problem of sexual assault. And this ad really showed how the legitimate concerns about dealing with often the traumatic effects of sexual assault have been melded with ideological attacks on masculinity in the name of social justice. So something that really, I think, makes a lot of sense, combined with something that most people would find quite dubious. So the ad was for an interpersonal violence clinician and men's engagement manager. 1/3 of the person's time would be devoted to providing traditional counseling services. The person had to have a degree in counseling and experience. My wife's a psychologist, so I think that's really terrific that they're hiring more psychologists. But the rest of the 2/3 of the time would be involved in, quote, promoting an environment for healthy male social development by challenging belief systems and social constructs that contribute to violence and offering alternative options. This includes, quote, compulsory accountability programming for students accused of misconduct. You don't have to be guilty to get the training, you have to be just accused. But in addition to having an advanced degree and experience in counseling, the applicant had to possess knowledge about the challenges and privileges of male identity formation and the relationships with violence. It must demonstrate that he or she has expertise in and is committed to social justice issues. I think that's a good opening for political theory graduate students, since they're the experts on social justice, but I've got a feeling that the Harvey students would not be included in the group of people considered. My point here is that, Title IX and Title VI of the Civil Rights on Race have been reinterpreted to say we really have to change people's fundamental beliefs about sex, race, and everything else. So they have to be re-educated by this coalition of administrators and of students and of a select group of teachers. That's very far afield from the original purpose of these pieces of legislation. Now, how far does this go in actually getting people to change their views about sex and race and anything else? I'm somewhat dubious about this. We also don't know that much about what goes on in most of these offices because, as Stuart Taylor has discovered, most of the training materials are kept secret. So I think it would behoove us all to find out what's going on in our own universities. The main thing I would say is that one of the things that adds to this movement is the ability of college administrators to say, we're doing this because federal law requires it. Now, the Trump administration withdrew many of these rules. They have not changed the existing format of these institutions. And I'm sure that regardless of the change in the rules, these administrators will keep telling us that federal law requires this. So my big advice and my appeal to you is, when they make those claims, challenge them. See what is required by federal rules, and you'll find that they are hiding behind federal rules in order to increase their own dedication to their mission. And one thing we can do is to try to tamp that down. Thank you.
Lindsay?
Okay. So this morning, I read 2 different articles. One was in GQ, and it was about how people who whine about a free speech problem, such as Bill Maher or Barry Weiss or Christina Hoff Sommers, are grifters. Another one was in The Guardian. It was written by Nesreen Malik. And the best quote from it, which kind of gets to the thesis, is freedom of speech is no longer a value. It has become a loophole exploited with impunity by trolls, racists, and ethnic cleansing advocates. So I guess everyone here today who is passionate about free speech is some sort of Hutu. So this is honestly nothing new, that freedom of speech is a loophole to promote alt-right or white supremacist ideas. Just the other day, a professor in my department at Wilfrid Laurier University tweeted that free speech is a ruse, and another professor in my department has written an op-ed where she said that free speech is an alibi for Islamophobia and neo-fascism. Others talk about the weaponization of free speech. And to be fair, these claims are applicable to some people. I had someone tell me that he's a free speech advocate, but in his ideal society, he would have blasphemy laws. So he was super religious. But obviously, we can't make such a wide generalization that free speech equals hidden hatred, because it's not true. That kind of thinking only serves to undermine like a constitutional right and undermine what we're able to openly discuss in a free society. And so these are issues I started to explore in November, and as Stephen Hayward briefly summed up, I'll go over the story. So indeed, I showed to my first year communication class, the class was Canadian Communication in Context, a couple minutes from public access television, a debate with University of Toronto professor Jordan Peterson, who's in psychology, and a professor of transgender studies, Nicholas Matt, and they had an exchange. This exchange was about Bill C-16, which at the time in Canada was going through Parliament. And it was about gender expression and gender identity and protecting the rights of gender non-conforming individuals. And from my understanding, most of the bill was completely reasonable. I mean, don't discriminate them in the job market and so on. However, Professor Jordan Peterson pointed out, and he was very vocal about this, that this was going to result in compelled speech of gender pronouns. And so he began to speak out about it. And he went from kind of just a professor to being, where he is now internationally recognized because of this issue. And so the exchange was Jordan Peterson arguing, this is going to infringe on free speech, and Nicholas Matt arguing that, well, you have to use pronouns because it's vital to people's integrity. You're denying them their dignity if you don't use the gender pronouns that they prefer. And so I showed this in my class. We talked about it, and there were students in my class on all sides of that issue. But it turns out that somehow this ended up as a complaint. And I got an email from my supervising professor a week later, and he said that I need to come have a meeting with him and a diversity and equity official. And so that kind of set off alarm bells in my head, and I actually called my mom, who's sitting right there now. And I was absolutely floored, and we discussed that it would be a good idea for me to go into that meeting and record it secretly. And so I did that, just to make sure that I'd be covered in case anything went terribly wrong and anything ridiculous was said. And it turns out there was a lot of ridiculous things said. I was accused of, so by virtue of just playing this YouTube clip of public access television, it's on the channel TV Ontario, which is the province that I live in. I was accused of creating a toxic climate because people's identities are not up for debate. So again, there's that equivalence between someone's very livelihood and a gender pronoun, a genderless pronoun. I targeted trans people. I actually myself violated federal law Bill C-16. So the very law that was brought up in that clip, I was being accused of violating it. I violated the Provincial Human Rights Code. And these two were debunked, by the way, according to Canadian journalists. But I did violate the university gendered and sexual violence policy. And I can see parallels definitely with Title IX. Because I played hate speech in the classroom. And again, if you don't know the law of hate speech in Canada, hate propaganda, it is two sections in the charter. So it's either advocating genocide or it's willfully promoting or inciting hatred against an identifiable group. I mean, I was not doing either of those things. They're saying that by virtue of discussing the linguistics of a gender pronoun and how they're used in society is equivalent to inciting hatred, right? And again, I did receive an apology, and they did exonerate me. It was actually more like a month after all this happened. Yeah, they had to ruminate over it for a while. And then there was an investigation done and everything, and eventually the investigation said there was no wrongdoing in the classroom. But still, I was mainly targeted by and again, I'm not gonna whine about being targeted, I'm just using it as a very neutral verb. I was targeted by the on-campus Rainbow Center, which is the LGBTQ center. And I had not really been ever involved in the politics of like sexual and gender identities. But I learned a lot about trans people and what their tactics are to kind of spread their message. One of the trans activists, because a lot of them are very vocal, she said that I violated the spirit of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, which is kind of ironic because freedom of expression is one of the fundamental rights in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And then also, I mean, my race played into this issue a lot as well. One editorial to the school newspaper said that I was upholding white supremacy through the guise of free speech, just because I happened to be white. Some other commentators on the news said that I was a crying white girl, and that made for some good internet memes. I think it's kind of funny. And yes, I was using my white tears to oppress minorities. Even bully Professor Rambukkana, who was my supervising professor, because he was a brown male and I was a white female. So in their intersectional identity politics, somehow I won and I was the one bullying him, even though in the secret recording, I don't think I'm bullying him, but you can hear it for yourself. I mean, you can Google it and listen to it if you haven't. Can decide if I was bullying him. And so this was not a one-off situation. Actually, this past Tuesday, I had kind of another run-in with censorship culture. So kind of as a result of all this controversy, because this was headlines in Canadian news, and eventually it trickled into American news and international, Russia, Sweden too. So I started a student group called the Laurier Society for Open Inquiry. And it's a free speech club, but it goes beyond that because it's actually about being able to openly inquire about ideas too, not just to spout off your opinion, right? And so we invited Faith Goldy, who is a former personality with Rebel Media, which I guess you could parallel with Breitbart, but in Canada. That'd probably be the closest thing. But she was fired from Rebel Media because she went on the Daily Stormer, the podcast, the neo-Nazi podcast, at the time of Charlottesville in the summer. And so she, from what I understand of her views, she advocates for a white ethno-state. Okay, and again, it's different than white supremacy, it's a white ethno-state. But anyway, we wanted to bring her in, and we wanted her to debate. We were going to have a debate about immigration in Canada. So we got her. She's a local. She lives in Toronto, so we secured her right away. And she's a polarizing figure for sure. But that's kind of what we wanted because sometimes, and Jonathan Rauch writes about this in his book, Kindly Inquisitors, sometimes it's actually good to have a very provocative figure because they spark an energized debate. So we got her to argue for close the borders and secure what she calls European Canadian identity. And then we reached out to multiple professors of immigration policy who would argue for the open borders side, but they all declined. So we had no one who would argue for open borders. And they declined. Some were quite open that they declined because they did not want to talk to Faith Goldy. And I wrote an op-ed this morning for Maclean's magazine in Canada, and I pointed out, like, well, if her arguments are so intellectually weak, then why not just do it? Wouldn't it be an easy win? But again, I guess you could call it cowardly. but no one accepted, so we decided to make this an unpopular opinion speaker series. And so she would do a 40-minute talk, and we'd have an open floor Q&A at the end, so just kind of the setup in this room, like a microphone. We wouldn't vet the questions, we wouldn't throw away the questions that we didn't want answered. You could go up to the microphone and you could ask her whatever you want, and you could confront her, because that's kind of the mandate of our club. That's what we want to encourage. And so on Tuesday, she came and we were in the room, and there was a counter-protest outside, a big counter-protest. Some sort of Antifa-like presence was there with their masks and their black and red flags that they were flying. And later in the night, someone would try to hand me a Ku Klux Klan robe. People were borrowing my, like when I was signing memberships at the start of the event, these people asked me to borrow paper, and they wrote, sorry, fuck Nazis, and then tossed the paper at me. And again, they would yell it in the crowd too, fuck Nazis. It was a reality, just it was completely divorced from the situation that was going on. And so they were doing their counter-protest, which is, of course, freedom of expression. Go ahead, do your counter-protest. But then, as we were doing the introductory remarks, Faith Goldy was about to present, the fire alarm goes off. And that was that, and the event was over. So even though, and by the way, we had 300 people who showed up for her event, 300. With the room filled up at 175, and we had to turn everyone else away. And from talking to a lot of people, many just wanted to hear what she had to say and then challenge her. So you're actually denying people a chance to challenge her too. So that's, again, pure censorship. It's no platforming. Articles were even written prior to the event by kind of the gender and race columnists of Canada who were saying, it's our mission to deplatform this speaker. The hashtag No Nazis at Laurier was going around, hundreds of tweets about that on social media. And a professor from, or an instructor from the faculty that I work in, that I TA in, he was ripping down my posters promoting the event. I saw him do it, and then he bragged about it on social media later. And what the lead protester, the person who led the counter-protest, she was saying it's against the human rights code to give space to someone who is actively oppressing people. And that's absolutely not true. But this is what I've learned from these experiences, right? Is that, so when I went into all the Jordan Peterson clip drama in November, I made it pretty clear that I considered myself a leftist, because that's just kind of how I saw myself. But now I have probably a deeper understanding, and now I would say that the campus left is pro-censorship. They're humorless, intolerant of diversity of thought. They rely on moral righteousness and slander. They will try to slander you if they don't agree. Just because we wanted to maybe talk about whiteness in Canada, they equate that right away to Nazism. And so by doing that, you're making it not okay to talk about it. And that's kind of scary to think that they're trying to make something very taboo in a free society. They're all about victimhood mentality, a culture of safe spaces. But now the euphemism is drop-in spaces, because we've made fun of safe spaces too much. So now it's drop-in space. So like when Laurier released something about the Faith Goldy event, they said there will be drop-in spaces available for people. I mean, no one's forcing them to go, but of course they just have to have a drop-in space. Someone wrote on Twitter, like, just take a nap, people, and then by the time you wake up, it'll be over. The campus left is all about no personal responsibility. Everything is a systemic problem, systemic oppression. When I brought up personal responsibility in one of my classes, so this is what happened. We were talking about the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action in Canada, which is about repairing relationships with Indigenous people. And it's quite a long document, and we were going through it. And I just pointed out, it's not a very insightful comment, but like that the document does not really emphasize personal responsibility. And so if you want to make progress in all these areas of, for example, the specific one we were talking about was reducing crime rates. I pointed out, well, what about the personal responsibility involved in that? And this girl, she looked at me and she said, "What do you mean personal responsibility?" And I said, well, like, don't commit crimes. And immediately everyone's, oh, shaking their head, like, oh, it kind of goes crazy. And it just kind of turns into this whole thing. This girl says something about how the prison system is white and heterosexual. I asked her what she meant by that, and she said, like minorities. So I don't know. I tried to press her on it, but it just doesn't work out. But anyway, I tweeted about that, and my class actually got canceled for the rest of the semester after that. After I tweeted about that, I guess they weren't happy that that exchange was tweeted about, and so the rest of our class was going to be presentations. There was 3 more classes, and she said, instead, you're just going to present to me one-on-one with the professor. And so we can no longer learn from each other's presentations or talk about each other's presentations. But even worse than that, actually, is she said, you can invite the classmates that you want to come. And to be, like, I don't want to be self-absorbed, but I think that's a comment on me, because obviously they're not going to invite me. I'm enemy number 1 at Laurier, by the way. If you spend a day with me there, you'll see. Yes, but so those that are claiming to be offended, they're kind of learning that it results in a moral victory. And again, the book I mentioned earlier, Kindly Inquisitors, Jonathan Roach, he wrote about this 20 years ago. And now this victimhood mentality is just part of our youth culture and our university culture. And I am trying to change it as much as I can. Thank you.
Larry Alexander.
Well, you know, I'm not going to have anything that tops Lindsay's story here. And I don't want to have anything that tops Lindsay's story. The old saying that liberal is a conservative is a liberal who was mugged by reality. That was, I think you were mugged more than once by reality. I always want to say something about Shep's discussion of the Title IX bureaucracy, and it's there's a, you know, all of us who've been on college campuses have sort of watched the growth of bureaucracies of various kinds, not just the Title IX. We have, and of course we are now subjected to various kinds of diversity training and all sorts of training, for which there's a whole industry that is benefiting. I sometimes wonder whether the laws that are purportedly behind these are actually been sponsored by these industries, which are set up to take several hours out of your day, and giving the answers that they want you to give. Also, just, I think Heather McDonald, who was mentioned earlier, I think she had a column a couple of years ago in which she pointed out that there were, I think, 17 or maybe 19 administrators at the University of California in San Diego who have diversity, equity, or inclusion in their title. And none of this is a surprise. I mean, when I went to Williams College, which was a small liberal arts college in the Northeast, my daughter went there. When we went back for homecoming, where there had been, a dean and an associate dean when I was there were now a multitude of associate deans. There was a dean for every racial and ethnic group. And so, and of course, that if you've been appointed to be the associate dean for this group, you've got to find events that give you a reason for being there and a reason to have your staff. So of course there are crises that then occur. Some of them turned out, the one that was going on while we were there for homecoming turned out to be a hoax. It turned out there were anti-black statements scrawled on the walls. The whole, the campus went into sort of lockdown, introspection. Turned out a black student had put that up there. But none of this, these are just sort of the inevitable things that occur with bureaucracies, and so none of it's all very sobering and sad, but there it is. Lindsay mentioned, the uttering the most hated words of all, personal responsibility, and I do have an anecdote about that. So I will, I'm here not because I actually am a free speech scholar. I actually have a book on free speech, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because of some event that I was part of in August, early August actually. A friend of mine at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, Amy Wax, and I penned an op-ed that was placed in the Philadelphia Inquirer. And in it, we said we thought a lot of the problems that we see in the country were due to the abandonment by large sections of the population of what we call bourgeois values, but it was just a list of, get as much education as you can, get married before you have children, work hard, pretty banal stuff. My worry when we published it was, it was going to make no waves at all because it was so sort of obvious, and people would just say, why are you wasting newsprint on something so obvious? Well, that didn't turn out to be the reaction that occurred. So the first reaction was that 33 members of the Penn Law faculty penned a letter condemning Amy, by implication me, but I'm not on the faculty there, condemning her for writing the op-ed. They did not take issue with any of the normative claims, because pretty hard to take issues with those. They're so sort of obvious. But, and it was an op-ed. It wasn't backed up with lots of citations. It wasn't a scholarly piece, though there's plenty of scholarship actually in the social sciences that back up the principal claims. But the condemnation was not, how could you advocate getting married before children? It wasn't that kind of a condemnation. It was a condemnation for just saying what we were saying. That was pretty much it. And there was not, we used as some examples, we said, among other things, that not all cultures are equal in the sense that, and we made this clear, they're not equal in preparing people to be, productive and prosperous in a 21st century economy. The culture of the Plains Indian, I think that was one of the examples we used. Might have been great if you were a nomadic hunter. It is not going to be a particularly useful culture in a high-tech 21st century economy. So those were the kinds of claims we made. There was a demand that Amy be removed from first-year required courses, presumably because, having said what we said, some people would feel uncomfortable in her class. The sort of causal relation between what she said and feeling uncomfortable in her class wasn't made very explicit to me or explicit to her. Well, that event at her school triggered an event at my school. It was not a sort of angry denunciation by my colleagues, quite the contrary, actually. However, the dean of the law school, having been, I think, although I'm not privy to this, I think what triggered this was the groups of angry students, I think basically the Black Law Students Association, went to the dean, I think triggered by the events that had happened at Penn, thinking, you know, this legitimizes our feeling victimized by this op-ed that somebody on our faculty is Penn. They went to the dean, and the dean issued a public statement to the entire community stating that he disagreed with the op-ed that I had co-authored, and he mentioned me by name, and he said, you know, he did say I had, you know, I was within my rights, freedom of speech to say what I did, but he disagreed with it. Moreover, it had made people feel excluded and uncomfortable and the like, and so they were going to introduce some programs. Now, so as I understand it, the black students, I didn't understand actually, I actually saw a petition that they had written. They wanted me, again, to be removed from any required courses so that they wouldn't have to suffer from, you know, just knowing that I had those views. So the dean did not remove me, nor did the dean at Penn remove Amy from her first year class, which I understand. I don't know this firsthand. She's quite a good teacher. At my school, something different happened. Several of my colleagues, lots of them actually, and including people who are, you know, major figures on the faculty, wrote publicly condemning the dean for doing what he did. And then there were several, this became national news. So, you know, this what I thought was going to be an unread op-ed suddenly became national news. Heather McDonald wrote a big op-ed in the Wall Street Journal condemning the deans of the two law schools for the dean at Penn had basically remonstrated against Amy, but had not removed her, but, you know, expressed his chagrin that she had written this. There were a number, I started getting inundated with calls from talk radio. I appeared on Tucker Carlson on Fox News. Suddenly my neighbors who knew me only as the guy walking the dog every day, you know, sort of, you know, knew something else about me, you know. But at my institution, things essentially died down. The thing I was angriest about actually with what the dean had done, well, two things. One is he could have made this a teaching moment for the students who had come in to complain. He could have, you know, interrogated them, dealt with them. Instead, you know, perhaps he feared that, you know, in today's consumer culture of law school, where law school deans worry about filling the seats with bodies, that, you know, there would be angry stuff put on Facebooks and potential student applicants wouldn't come because of the racist, oppressive atmosphere at the law school. I think my guess is that some of that was going through his mind in not making this a teaching moment. The other thing, though, and I don't think the dean even gave this a thought, was how this was going to affect my relation with my students. This occurred before classes began in the fall. So I had 2 large classes. I had a, I had an introductory, I had a first semester criminal law class, 80 some odd students, several of them minority students, quite a few. I was wondering, what his public statement going to do to my relationship with the students and their ability to learn. And then I had an upper division constitutional law course that took up all the hot button issues, abortion, same-sex marriage, affirmative action. I had 80 students in there. I was wondering how this was going to affect, what I did. The happy ending for me is that apparently there was no effect. The students knew about all this, but so I was, I would say no harm, no foul, except there was no harm, but there was a foul in this. Amy did not fare as well. And it turns out that the event, Amy was essentially persona non grata with most of her faculty. The dean tried to get her to give up her civil procedure class, which is a first-year required course, which is her bread and butter course. She refused. He thought she might want to take her sabbatical leave a year early. She refused. I think the dean was highly frustrated. So, but then another event just occurred recently. Back in the fall, in September, I believe, Amy was on a blog interview with Glenn Lowry, a black economist, and they discussed quite, in a quite amicable way, a variety of issues on which Amy has very strong views. And they finally got, in the end, to affirmative action, and Amy basically said she was against affirmative action on the basis of race because it leads to a sort of black underclass, sort of lowest grades going to people because they were admitted under, they were admitted under with qualifications that did not make them competitive with the other students. And of course, you're graded against the other students. So in that, given that, and this, as I said, this occurred in September, but Amy, somebody saw this, and then brought it to everyone's attention. And Amy had said in the course of this that in her personal experience in her civil procedure class, the large class, very few blacks had scored in the top half, and she couldn't remember anyone scoring in the top quarter of the class. Well, this could have been viewed as a kind of a minor violation of student privacy. Grades are anonymous. We grade exams anonymously, and then after the grades are turned in, we get to see who got what grades, and so you can find out these things. But other students are not supposed to know unless other students reveal to them their grades. So this, in a sense, might have obliquely revealed, that some student didn't get in the top quarter of the class. That was, and so, that would be viewed in the normal things as a kind of a faculty misdemeanor, a kind of a small offense, a parking ticket equivalent kind of offense. But that isn't the way it was received. And indeed, this created a new firestorm. The black students at Penn demanded that Amy be removed from any required course. And this time the dean capitulated to this and removed her from her first-year class. That's, you may have seen earlier this week, maybe Tuesday, Heather McDonald had another op-ed in the Wall Street Journal citing this particular event. What lesson do you take away? Well, one thing that is clear, and this is particularly clear in Amy's case, because nobody actually gainsayed her statements about what happens if you lower the qualifications for students and then they compete against other students. No one would gainsay that. So her sin was saying something that almost everybody knew, but the word was you can't say what you know. And indeed, you can't say something that everybody else knows. The sin was to voice it, was to give it voice. Now that's a pretty chilling thing in a university setting. If you can't say what you believe, if you can't say, I'm always reminded the most illustrative fable for the current climate in universities today, and indeed it goes out into the outer society as well, is The Emperor's New Clothes, where everyone, you had to say that the emperor's clothes were just gorgeous, even though the emperor was buck naked. And
That's a Title IX violation.
Okay. So what happened is that Amy said the emperor's naked, and everybody knew the emperor's naked. Everyone was afraid to say it, and the danger in the academy with not being able to say what you know is that pretty soon you stop knowing it because you couldn't say it. You get cognitive dissonance, leads you to start believing the emperor really is wearing clothes because everybody else is saying the emperor is wearing clothes, and that is destructive of the core mission of a university. And it's happening not just in our little episode, our little drama, but across the board.
Thank you, Larry. George, did we get your slides set up?
We're going to right now.
We're going to go right now? Okay, good.
So I should say, first of all, bear with me. I've never actually done anything with slides. I borrowed my 12-year-old daughter's laptop to do this. She says, I don't know, Dad, sounds like a bad idea.
That explains the stickers on the back.
But that explains all the stickers. So, right, I'm just going to
I know a little bit of this.
plug in. But I thought it would be better to show some of the surveys.
Oh, you know what? You have got.
I've been reading about it. I didn't realize that.
And this has also got the You know what?
I don't have to look at it.
You have the wrong kind of Mac for that. But I may have to see it.
Early in the morning, panel back
Can we go like
sees
this? We can just
me,
go
I'm saying, with
Oh, I don't think that's. Yeah, that might work. There you go. Try that.
and try to get someone to back me.
That should.
Oh, wait a minute.
That's progress.
That's not me.
Yeah, no, it's not you. Where's
See,
your
she's
little-
right.
Where's your little bar that you have there? There's a little toolbar thing.
I've been messing with it. It's
Because
It's
we're
like
not
a-
getting a mirror
Like a
to
pastoral
the,
scene there, an orchard.
here we go. Where do we need to go?
Well, I have another idea.
Okay.
I think we might do. Nope, that didn't work.
Yeah, that's not me. Oh,
There we go.
there we are.
There we
Oh,
are.
voila.
There we go.
Okay, I can't see these now.
Yeah,
but
well,
so let me. I'll go through the slides in a second. But let me say, like others on this panel, I was kind of forced to think about free speech because of events at my own campus. Happily for me, they weren't nearly as personal as the events of Larry and Lindsay. But it was, as Steve said already, it was a shutdown of a talk by Heather McDonald. And hundreds of student protesters surrounded the venue where McDonald was supposed to speak, kind of had arms locked together, 3 and 4 deep, and kept faculty and students out from speaking. Her talk was then live streamed. There were a few faculty and students who were already in the building who got to see it live. It was live streamed, so it went out to, by the administration's sense of things at least, to far more people than would have seen it at the venue itself. But it really forced us to think about free speech and the place of free speech on campus. Now, I want to say right away that I did not invite McDonald, and I actually even confess I did not know who Heather McDonald was until this happened. And I learned about the shutdown about an hour or so before it took place from my students in seminar, because it was all the rage on social media. Point I want to get to in a moment, because I think that that's changed some of the dynamics on campus. But so this event forced the campus to actually think about the place of freedom of speech, and there was lots of discussion about student attitudes, but we didn't really know exactly what student attitudes were. And so along with a handful of my students, I proposed a survey of student attitudes that it would at least give us some sense of the student attitudes on free speech at Claremont McKenna, and we hope to go more broadly with it. And so what I want to do first is present a few of those results, and especially focus on 2 of those questions that I'm going to get to in a moment, and that's a lot of the issues that are being discussed, the place of freedom of speech on campus against creating a welcoming environment. But I also want to focus on a place we don't speak to as often, and that's freedom of speech in the classroom. Because I really think when we're thinking of colleges and universities, we can think of sort of 3 settings, right? We have, particularly at residential colleges, the place where students live, which is very different, say, than what we call the public forum, right? And that public forum is very different than from the classroom. And I really want to focus on the public forum part of it first, but then the classroom part of it second. But I want to, after going over a few of the slides, I want to speak more broadly to issues about freedom of speech, because I think in some ways issues about freedom of speech that we're seeing maybe are really a symptom of a deeper crisis in education. And I think in a way it's related to the purpose of higher education and liberal education in particular. And then in a way we've kind of lost sight of this. And so that the problem is much broader in this way than sort of an intolerant academic left, which actually seems to be, by most survey evidence, a minority of students on campus and a minority of faculty on campus as well. But so let me run through the basic survey, and I'll get to the 2 important questions I want to focus on. But first, this just gives you an idea, and we sampled, it was over 10% of the student body. It's a small college, it's 1,300 students, so we sampled over 10% of the students. And just to kind of anticipate questions that might come up, this was the racial makeup of the campus, and our Office of Institutional Research. I know there have been issues at Berkeley. Our Office of Institutional Research was terrific in helping survey. In fact, all we did is told them what we wanted to do with the questions, and they then said, hey, we will make sure we get you a sample that reflects the student body and the student population. It was approved by Institutional Review Board in less than 48 hours. Although I will say, speaking of all the administrators that Larry and Shep have pointed to, I did get some interesting emails from administrators once this was approved, because our administration doesn't approve it. It's actually a faculty board that approves it. And everybody was very supportive first, but then they said, well, you know, survey data can be abused. It has its limitations and the like. And I said, yeah, we're well aware of all of that, but can we actually do a survey, and we'll see from there. But so this reflects the racial makeup at the campus. So Steve, that was great what you did, but now I don't see how I can go down.
This is why I never use.
I should have brought my 12-year-old daughter with me.
If you look there,
If I look,
scroll there.
okay, so if I just scroll down, that'll work. Okay, so let's go right. So then here are the party preferences of the campus. As you can see, the campus is fairly typical. It very much leans moderately left. There are a lot more independents than Republicans, more Democrats than others. Let's scroll to the. All right, how did you do this again?
2 fingers.
Two fingers.
That's right. This is your daughter's computer.
This is my. I really. Oh, okay. There we go.
Okay.
Oh, so now the political outlook of the campus. And I'll mention a few variations here. As you can see, this is asking students how they would describe the political outlook of the campus. Actually, I think my slide right before that. All right, Steve.
Scroll up.
No, I want to actually go back to the next one.
The previous one?
Yeah, I think because I think we skipped the how their political outlook.
You want? Wait a minute. Where'd your cursor go? Uh-oh, it disappeared. Ah, there it is. So you want to go back. Whoops, come on. There, that one?
Yes, this is how they.
I'm going to hang it over here.
Okay, so thank you. So this is how they. This is how students view the political outlook of the campus. Now there are some interesting variations, not surprisingly. This is the total survey population. If you actually disaggregate the survey, turns out, not surprisingly, that conservative students, or those who are Republicans as our proxy for that, view the campus as more liberal than liberal students. And when you actually view it by race, there are differences there. There were certainly black students who viewed the campus as far more conservative. In fact, black students tended to view it as centrist, as liberal, centrist, and conservative about equal measures, which was very different than white students in that regard. So I can just go to the next one.
Two fingers. So you do. You take two fingers like this. Where'd your cursor go? And then you just pull. You push up if you go to the next slide.
All right.
Two fingers together.
And so this is how they then describe the makeup of the campus. And it seems to, everybody agrees that it's, except for, again, African Americans are a little different than that. They don't think that it's more conservative than liberal, but they certainly, more of them think that it is conservative than white students tend to. All right. I'm totally inept. I need one of those clickers if I'm going to do this. Here we go. Oh, there we go. No, right here, political outlook. Go one more. Let's go to. Oh, I think I doubled one. Go to 10 now. I did this. Okay, so and then we wanted to do two questions to look at things. We wanted to see both freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, and this is an interesting distinction because the students actually split on this one. And in the new national survey that came out, there's a big split there as well. And the split there is that when you move outside of campus life, right, Democrats, and then this also varies by race, if you do take, say, minority students especially, view freedom of assembly as much less secure, whereas conservatives tend to view freedom of speech as much less secure on campus. And so we wanted to try to capture that variation. And in our own survey of Claremont McKenna student attitudes, we saw some of this split. It was Republican students that tended to think that freedom of speech was most threatened, although they, again, thought it was more secure than not on the whole. And then it also tended to be Democratic students who thought that freedom of assembly was more under threat than conservative students did or Republican students did. Okay, thank you so much. I can't even, I'm so technologically inept, I can't even do two fingers and make it work. And so then here's the results about freedom of assembly on campus as well. And you can see those, and again, there with the variation I suggested, Democrats tend to view this as more threatened than Republicans do.
One trick here.
Oh, I can do that.
Yeah,
There we go. I should have thought of that.
wait, just stop there.
That's what I want to know. It just, see,
Okay,
there's a...
Let me try the, that's not right. We should be, there we go.
Okay, so, and this is what the view from, again, the student perspective, what proportion of students on your campus respect freedom of assembly for all students and freedom of speech. On the whole, all groups tended to think that most students respected it. There was some variation. In Republicans, for instance, tended to think it was more some students that respected it. Democrats were more likely to think when it came to assembly, as you'll see, that some students respected it. And then African American students also thought when it came to assembly that it was really mostly some students that respected it. I'm just going to totally overdo this. It's just a waste of time for me to do this. Now, here's the question I want to really then discuss the most, and then the second one following this. And that's, in terms of the learning environment, which do you think a college should prioritize? And this is the survey, the big national survey that just occurred, really spoke to this question as well. And this seems to me to speak to the issues that we're really talking about so far on this panel, and that's, should we prioritize an open environment that allows kind of wide open discussion, and in terms of having wide open discussion, allow things that are offensive to be said, but that's what higher education is about, or do we prefer a safe environment? And you can see overwhelmingly our students said that they prefer an open environment. Now the catch is, and I'll get to that with the next slide, there's a lot of debate about context. And one of the things we're at least thinking about doing with the survey is, first, we'd like to probably survey the other 4 colleges in Claremont. And Claremont is an interesting place because you've got 5 liberal arts colleges with quite different personalities all next to one another, and you might get very different results at them, but we have to go through their institutional review boards and the like to get this. We didn't have time to do that. I've heard that could be a problem. I'll let you know if it is. But we also have been invited by Brown, Indiana, and some other places to do surveys there. And the second part of it that I'll speak to more in a minute is that we're thinking about doing more contextual surveys. So not more contextual surveys, but more contextual interviews, because this just captures a snapshot. And the real kicker, right, is, so students in Lindsay's class had said, yeah, of course I prefer an open environment. No, she can't say those things in class. That's sort of different. And so can you then tease that sort of thing out? Because this is just the snapshot. And just one small point on the variation. Democrats were a little bit more likely to say they prefer a safe environment, but not by much. African-American students, there was not much difference at all. They also overwhelmingly preferred, it was something like 82% preferred the open environment that allows for potentially offensive speech. I think I've only got 2 more. It's okay. Now here's the one that I think starts to get you some details on this. And so what would you then allow the administration to do, preferring an open environment first? What sorts of restrictions? And can we actually get it? Because you want to see the questions on the bottom, if you can do that a little bit. Right, now overwhelmingly, and this doesn't change much by party affiliation, restricting students from using language or hate speech that is specifically derogatory toward a group. So I think one of the things interviews would have to tease out is, so what context would you allow, or what kinds of prohibitions would you allow in this case? Now it could well be kind of on its surface, and I think that there's a plausible argument for this, given what we have in these questions, that students are really viewing hate speech in very specific terms. If you think in constitutional law terms, there's an old standard that it's not just that speech is merely offensive, it's that it's aimed as a sort of personal insult at an individual, and that what are called fighting words are not protected. That is so, but the catch is, right, the speech can't just be sort of generally offensive, it actually has to be aimed at an individual, and I think there's at least an argument to be had that that kind of speech, targeted at an individual specifically, right, that is meant to be just derogatory to them, maybe doesn't belong on college campuses. Now, that reading is at least plausible if you look at the second question, which says, could you restrict students from expressing views that are upsetting and offensive to certain groups, right? And very few students think that that's acceptable, right? And I think that that reading might be consistent with hate speech in very narrowly defined terms. But again, that's something that we'd really have to do more interviews and the like to tease out, because it could well be that in the abstract, students like an open environment, think that a university is about robust dialogue and the like, but then you turn to some specific instances of speech, and they're going to be far more likely to call for some forms of protection. And you might get that, for instance, many students, and again, interesting here, not much variation between Democrats and Republicans on this question, restricting students from wearing costumes that stereotype certain racial or ethnic groups. Among this generation, there seems to be a lot of support for those kinds of restrictions, or a lot more than you might think. Now, I got one last one, I think. This is the one that I actually want to focus on. No, this is not it. This is my mistake of putting another PDF in the middle.
Okay, one more?
One more. Let's see what that is.
Wait.
Go.
That's the right one, or do we?
No, I think it needs to go one more down. Keep going.
One more?
One more. Oh, this is where I want to go. Yes, thank you. That's it. I'll tell my daughter it was a triumph. So, I mean, because this is the area where I don't think we focus a lot. I mean, we tend to focus on these big explosive events, shutting down Heather Mac Donald, right? I mean, the kinds of events that both Lindsay and Larry have experienced, and I don't want to downplay those events at all. And I mean, those events are cause for serious concern. But when you think of the shutting down of speakers, I mean, they're unpredictable in ways. I mean, Heather Mac Donald speaks at Berkeley, no incident. UCLA, a little bit of one. Claremont McKenna, it's explosive, right? And she gets shut down. Charles Murray, the same thing. I mean, he speaks at Middlebury and it's shut down. A few weeks later, he speaks at Brown and it's fine. A little bit after that, he speaks at Columbia and it's just fine. I mean, so, I mean, while we focus on those events because, I mean, those events, you know, obviously capture our attention and imagination, I'm not sure they're the most important events to focus on in thinking about the challenges to free speech as it relates to the purpose of higher education more generally, right? And I think the idea of students engaged in self-censorship in a serious way, which you can see from these questions. So do you filter comments in class out of concern for any of the following reasons? This came as the biggest shock to me, and I confess the one that maybe I shouldn't have been shocked by, but was the most shocked by, was the first one, right? That they're really trying to, or you know, a significant number of them, and this is kind of a check-all that apply, are self-censoring because of professors and what they think the professors' political views and attitudes are. I mean, that's problematic, but I actually think it's the ones that follow that are most problematic in our current context. And that is, right, expressing an opinion contrary to that of a majority of the classroom because it will result in social alienation. At least on our campus, almost half the students are doing that. I mean, they're simply, you know, withholding their ideas because they're worried that engaging them will lead to some kind of social alienation. And then when you look at the second one, right, expressing an opinion that some may consider offensive will result in social alienation. 50% of our students are doing this. There is some interesting breakdown here, and one of the interesting things was that sort of everybody agreed that conservatives probably have the hardest time here. Liberal students, right, if we take Democrat as a proxy for liberal, thought that conservatives were more likely to engage in self-censorship. African Americans thought that as well. The two groups that thought, though, they probably could least likely express their genuine opinions were Republicans and African American students. But so I think we don't focus on this aspect as much, but I think this is maybe where the real problem lies when we think about the future of higher education. When we're engaged in this kind of potential self-censorship here, because we're really worried about widely engaging ideas, and you know, it doesn't grab the headlines, but this is where education is really supposed to be going on. And so my concern is that it's, and notice this is not coming from the administration necessarily. I mean, it's all the Title IX and the proliferation of administration that Shep spoke to, I think, kind of feeds on this. But these are students really worried, especially in a social media environment, about their fellow students' reactions, right? And that what they're worried about is that they're going to be, right, the next Larry or Lindsay in that way, right? I mean, they say something and then it's going to explode, and they're worried about how that's going to happen. I mean, so they're in these, and we could think of a classroom as, in some sense, the traditional safe space. I mean, safe in that you really should be free to engage in wide-ranging discussion of ideas, and it doesn't seem to be happening. I can actually let that go now because I'll. Thanks so much, Steve. So, but let me then, you know, conclude by raising a couple of issues that I think aren't as prominently discussed. And I think the first one is really the classroom setting. As I said, I think you really have three spaces, especially in residential colleges, where students live. Of course, rules that regulate speech there should be very different from the public space, the public forum version of freedom of speech. But that's very different than from the classroom. And I'm most concerned about what's going on in the classroom as the part of it that we pay the least attention to, but I think is probably the most pernicious in terms of the actual mission and future of higher education. So I want to conclude by just saying a few words about how I would situate this within the context of liberal education more generally. Because I think, in a way, sort of we've lost our way in part because we no longer think about the purpose of higher education. And I want to, especially in the public university setting, I want to return a little bit to Thomas Jefferson, right? And because I think the arguments for why you have public institutions of higher education have not really changed much from Jefferson's defense of the University of Virginia. And it was really twofold, right? I mean, you first had, as Jefferson put it, the idea of pursuing knowledge, right? As Jefferson said, it should be an illimitable freedom of the human mind, right? And the pursuit of knowledge itself would lead to the improvement, both moral and physical, of the human condition. But Jefferson's other argument for the University of Virginia, beyond just knowledge, was that it would also benefit liberal democracy, that American constitutional institutions would benefit from it because it would cultivate not just enlightened citizens, but particularly, and this, I think, will smack as sort of elitist, but I think there's no getting around the fact that elite institutions are going to be somewhat elitist, and they're cultivating leaders, future leaders of the public, and you're also trying to cultivate a certain sense of citizenship and a certain mindset there, and that we're less attentive to that. Now, I think Jefferson's model is important because it's the one that really set the ground for public institutions generally. I mean, not quite 50 years after the University of Virginia was established, Berkeley is established and really took up many of its justifications for the public university from Jefferson's argument for UVA. And so I think in this way, right, we should think about how higher education is not just about careers, which I want to get to in a moment, but really is, in some ways, a cultivation of citizenship, and democratic citizenship in particular. And it's not just that the universities are about knowledge. That's what they're first and foremost about, and that's why freedom of speech is so important there. But it also becomes a model of democratic citizenship. And as several of the panelists have pointed out, right, I mean, you can't really engage ideas in a real way if you're then going to protect students from ideas that are out there, right? I mean, that they're kind of lurking in the real world. And if you're going to prepare them for democratic citizenship, and you've got to prepare them not just to engage in analytical thought, not just to evaluate arguments and evidence, not just to tolerate those they disagree with, right? Because they're going to have to do that when they go out into the world, but we tend to forget that part of it. And I would even say, just thinking about the history of freedom of speech generally, it probably comes as a shock to most students, right, that only 50 years ago, maybe 75, the middle years of the 20th century, it was actually conservatives trying to censor liberals, right? And if you walk around the Berkeley campus, you see, 1950, it was the year that the University of California asked its faculty to pledge that they were not communists. Right? Several of them refused the pledge. Earlier than that, Alexander Meiklejohn, who makes the very kind of arguments for freedom of speech that conservatives now make, was asked to resign the presidency of Amherst College because he wasn't cultivating the right set of sort of political beliefs and values in his students. That is, he wasn't engaging them to be conservative gentlemen, right? He was actually asking for a far more robust discussion of freedom of speech. We don't really have that understanding. And if we actually had a better sense of the university, I think we would have a deeper sense of that understanding. So part of what I think we need to recover is a sense of higher education. Now, let me provoke you on two counts here. I think first, right, I mean, if the academic left is part of the problem, right, so too are conservatives bringing in speakers who are really just mere provocateurs, right? Why is Berkeley inviting Milo Yiannopoulos to speak? Now, let me be clear. I don't think that what's required is that he be prohibited on First Amendment grounds. I think that's probably impossible. But what I'm talking about changing are attitudes, right? I mean, and attitudes that are connected with higher education there. And so why are we bringing a Milo Yiannopoulos to speak on campus? I mean, we should think about it. It seems totally disconnected from what the university is about. The second part of it, and I'll end on this note, is I think the careerist ethos is part of the problem, right? Students increasingly, partly because of administrators, but partly because of outsiders, view education in largely careerist terms, right? And here you had, to just name 3 of our top public universities, at University of Virginia, at North Carolina, and at Wisconsin, right? Republican politicians wanted to change the language of the university from, supporting democratic citizenship and knowledge to providing for, as it was in Wisconsin, the workforce needs of the state. That is far removed from the actual mission of higher education, and I think that is also one of the problems, part of the problems that we speak much less about. Thank you.
So we're running a little bit long, but I've got a couple of quick follow-up questions to press to some parts that have been raised but not crystallized enough. And I think I want to start with you, Lindsay, with one. I hesitate to use the word intersection because it's taken on all these meanings today, but you're kind of caught at the intersection of this problem. You mentioned a lot of the sort of cliches and slogans about systemic oppression and other things. They're very familiar to us here at American universities. To, I think, maybe borrow and adapt the language Machiavelli might use, there are armed doctrines behind this, right? I mean, these aren't just things that spontaneously happen. And you mentioned that your field is cultural analysis and social theory. I'm not sure if that's the same as what we call cultural studies or critical theory here. It is? Yeah, and I have a hard time getting my hands around all that. I'm sure some of it is sensible. An awful lot of what I see seems insensible or radicalized and ideologized. And so to what extent is some of this traced back to the field that actually you're studying?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think I'm probably in one of the most cultish programs. My program is interdisciplinary, and so I think they take the most radical of each faculty and throw them together in my program. And I didn't know. And someone wrote me like a fan mail letter, and they said, Lindsay, you're not innocent in this situation. You chose that program. And I was like, well, fair enough. I just didn't get it at the time. I mean, November, like all this, was really a wake-up call for me.
Well, I didn't mean to put you on a spot about that, but I want to sort of press on for you and also Shep in a different way. What remedy, Larry, your lawyer, what remedies do you think need to occur for this atmosphere to change?
Well, the thing is, the students, is it my mic doing this? Or it's mine? Oh.
It's not mine.
Hey, just turn this one off, so try again.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
Keep going.
Sure. Yeah.
It might be your hair, actually.
Is it?
I think it's your hair, yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Don't worry.
Well, yeah, so basically I started talking about free speech, but I realized that this is almost kind of superficial, and there's so many things that are bubbling beneath the surface that play into the situation. I think one important point is the quality of the graduate students. And one professor actually pointed out to me that my university, and I'm sure this is the case for many, they have an economic need for graduate students because at this point they would not be able to run their undergraduate programs without the TAs, the labor that they're provided from graduate students. Because, for example, me, my package for accepting my offer was you do a TA-ship. It's like basically I don't pay for my degree, but I work as a TA. And so that's part of it and I would really encourage anyone who thinks this is like some sort of myth and exaggeration, these people who write articles about free speech grifting, is to sit in one of these classrooms about like a gender studies or cultural studies or communication studies classroom. I actually wanted to make a bingo card. I can read out the terms that would be on my bingo card for sitting through one of these classes. There would be neoliberalism, intersectional, Islamophobia, feminism, representation, colonialism, discourse, race, gender, identity, Foucault, and indigenous.
And
queer.
Not
and racialized.
Europhalo logocentric or any.
Oh, that's if you want to get really fancy.
Yeah.
But
Doesn't
yes,
fit
I
on
mean, this is all my classes are about. I mean, for example, you watch a commercial, a Nike commercial, and you talk about the representation of women, racialized women, and that's kind of the intellectual depth that you go into.
Yeah, there might be an app in that bingo card idea. You can make a fortune on it. Let me turn to some audience questions or comments. I mean, we've got a
Can I
time.
just say one thing about remedies? And I think the most important remedy is for people who are not in cultural studies, people who are in the natural sciences and the social sciences, to speak up. Because my sense is, and I think this follows what George is saying, that the people who are most vocal on this are a minority. I think that, and I would just give one example. At Boston College, I discovered that there was a new item on the Office of Student Affairs, which was a biased incident report team that allowed anonymous reports against any form of bias, including those in the classroom. And so that was really disturbing to me. I complained about it, and I discovered that there was a lot of support for shutting this thing down. Actually, the dean and the provost supported me, other faculty did, and they put an end to it.
Yeah, I know that the recent example at Lewis and Clark College Law School, where Christina Hoff Sommers was protested, a number of the law students have filed reports and complaints with their bias incident response team against some of those other students who were doing that. And so we'll see how that plays out. Question or comment from the audience? Yeah, go ahead, right here in front. Speak good and loudly. And
So, my sister goes to school at UC Santa Cruz, and similar to Berkeley, I would say that both universities are kind of at the epicenter of all that's going on right now. And she's in the environmental program, which sort of similar to gender studies and that sort of thing. It's very vitriolic, and my sister has expressed to me before that she's worried about expressing anything that's outside the norm, and she's been assigned papers that are, these are the exact sources you will use. So not very much expression possible when you're only very narrowing the diameters of discussion. And so this thing that George Thomas was talking about, where people are scared to speak up, I think also related to that is like the implicit violence, or explicit actually, in case of like with the Faith Goldie thing, and then here with Milo Yiannopoulos. My question is, why has it become so violent and aggressive, the discourse? Why has it become so agitated, the climate these days, and how would you solve that?
yeah, so I'll just say, by the way, what do you expect from a university whose mascot is the banana slug? It's UC Santa Cruz. Let me sort of add on, or not modify, but add on to that question that, you mentioned Jonathan Rauch's book, Kindly Inquisitors, from 20 years ago. So in a certain sense, a lot of what we're seeing is not new, but I do think there seems to have been a step increase. And so my version of your question is what explains that? Was there some turning point? Is this just what we call preference cascade in social science? Or what explains the vitriol? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I might have a partial answer.
Partial's
I
fine.
think for those Antifa types, I think they just need a crusade because it occupies their time and it kind of gives them purpose. And if they do a degree like mine and they don't really know what to do, they just become an activist, I suppose, for their gender and race and diversity causes. And so that's why they blow things like an open floor Q&A and talk into this is a Nazi recruitment session. They blow it up because it kind of plays into their crusade and gives them purpose.
Anybody else? Larry?
I do know that things have become much more vitriolic, and I do think there's something to what Lindsay said. A lot of times, this is as the term gets used, virtue signaling, and so you show your virtue by being firmly showing that you're on the right side of everything. And I'm always amazed, actually, that people come into college at age 18 or so, and they already know what social justice requires, right? Why study? they're paying a lot of money for things they already know the answers to, apparently. That always, one of the things, though, I mean, one remedy would be to go through your university or college and eliminate all departments that are not true disciplines, that do not have disciplinary standards, and where the work product, either in the classroom or in the research, does not conform to known disciplinary standards. So, and that would eliminate a lot of the problem, and it would eliminate a lot of the cost of universities. And what happens is, once these departments, which are a product of some sort of white guilt or something, once they get established, they metastasize, and they become the affirmative action departments, and then they have their own demands, and whatever led people to allow them to be established then allows them, gives them more moral credence than they've actually earned. So, I think, that's a really tough-minded kind of statement, but in fact, gender studies, cultural studies, all of these are not studies. I mean, these are grievance polemic departments. They're not, and you can know it by the fact that they don't make testable claims with actual evidence and arguments. And it's, frequently the sign you see, sort of postmodernist, obscurantist rhetoric. They're the kinds of terms that were thrown at Lindsay. These are empty. These are sort of, these are just verbal weapons, but they don't represent any kind of disciplinary knowledge. And the university is supposed to be a place for disciplinary knowledge, and both to acquire it and to disseminate it. And if it's not doing that, it is spreading essentially a disease around, and it's not just in the universities now. It's gone down into the high schools and junior high schools. I was listening to one of the kids from Parkland High School. Feel sorry for the guy. He's been, it's a very traumatic, awful event. But then he's being treated. He's talking about his white privilege and, how Congress needs to be more diverse. He didn't pick that up, out of the air. I mean, it's just, he's steeped in it by the time he came out of, junior high school.
Quickly,
I
I'll give you the
still
last
want
word.
I don't want Trump to be let off the hook on this.
Oh, right.
I mean, to talk about the escalation of ugly rhetoric, he certainly has fed this. Also, he has certainly fed the view that behind any conservative thought lies racism and prejudice and racial resentment. So I think he has both escalated the harmful rhetoric and provided a rationale for people who want to discredit anything that seems to be conservative.
Yeah, I've been thinking, it's hard to measure what Trump's effect on things in the social science terms, but I think that's probably right. It also has to be our last word for this session. We've run a little bit long. We'll take a break here for about 15, 20 minutes and assemble for our last panel, which will talk about the nature of diversity and intellectual diversity and what ways they should overlap. So please thank our panel for